Hey everyone, welcome to our Build a Brain presentation. We're Annie and Simon. Today we're going to walk you through how cannabis affects the brain in the three stages of baseline, sober, active intoxication, and withdrawal. We're also using like physical drawings and representations of brains and those systems for visual representation. We'll reference it throughout the presentation to show you what regions we're talking about. All right, let's get started. Oops. Here we go. So this is just our overview. It's a roadmap of kind of what we're going to be doing, the substance use profile, sober, intox, withdrawal, and clinical applications and takeaways. So cannabis is one of the most commonly used illicit substances in the world. You also might know it by dozens of different kinds of street names: weed, pot, Mary Jane, marijuana, ganja, dads. Federally, it remains at a Schedule I controlled substance under the Controlled Substance Act. Because of this, it's classified as having high misuse potential, and it's not accepted for medical use, even though we know that that's a complicated picture. So chemically, cannabis contains two major compounds that we care about neurologically: the THC, which is the psychoactive component that creates the high, and the CBD, which is non-psychotropic and actually helps modulate the THC's effects. So people use cannabis in a lot of ways. By smoking, vaping are the most common, but people also use edibles, tinctures, and topical applications. And it's listed on here as well as suppositories, which I thought was really interesting. This matters because the route of administration affects the onset of duration. An edible can take a couple of hours to take effect and last 4 to 8 hours, while being smoked, cannabis acts within just a few minutes. So dosing ranges widely from 1 to 5 milligrams for a threshold for microdosing up to 100 plus milligrams, which is called a heroic dose and carries serious risk, especially for inexperienced users. Importantly, the half-life of the metabolite, THC-COOH, ranges from 20 to 57 hours. Occasional users, to 3 to 13 days in regular users, which is why cannabis shows up on drug screens so long after intoxication has passed. So the mechanism of action, how does it actually work in the brain? The key is the endocannabinoid system, a signaling network that our brains actually produce naturally using molecules called anandamide. I just researched on how to say this too. And 2-AG. These normally work through a process that's called retrograde signaling. That's where the receiving neuron sends the chemical message back to the sending neuron to regulate how much neurotransmitter gets released. It's kind of like a feedback control system. THC mimics the endocannabinoids and binds to the CB1 and 2 receptors, but as a partial agonist. It doesn't just activate the receptor normally, it hijacks and disrupts the whole retrograde signaling system across multiple circuits simultaneously. Next, we're going to get, CBD, is opposite of THC. CBD is a negative allosteric modulator. At CB1, it actually dampens the receptors activity, countering many of the THC's effects. This is why CBD dominant strains of cannabis has a completely different neurological profile than the THC heavy one. So an important pharmacokinetic point, THC is highly lipid soluble, which means it crosses the blood-brain barrier very rapidly, but it also gets stored in fat tissue, which contributes to that long detection window in your analysis and drug screens and things like that. So first, I'm going to show you a quick, I tried to do my best with a sober brain, just based on the cannabinoids and the things that it's going to affect. So here you can kind of see these are the main areas that are going to have CB1 dense regions, which are green, and dopamine pathways are blue. But here are some of the areas that are highly affected when THC is introduced into the system. Otherwise, we're going to assume everything's kind of at a homeostasis state where everything's in balance and functioning normally. These colors are just representing kind of some of the regions that it will affect in talks. I kind of went over this already just a little bit, but we'll go into a little bit more depth. So the sober state, like I said, it's homeostasis, balance. The prefrontal cortex is handling the executive functioning, impulse control and planning. The nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area are doing their normal jobs in the reward circuit without any like external manipulation. The hippocampus is consolidating memories. The amygdala is responding to threats, not like amplified ones. Appetite and sleep are regulated by the hypothalamus in healthy rhythms. The anandamide and 2-HE are being released on demand, and dopamine is at its baseline, so GABA and glutamate are balanced. So where was it? So here you can just kind of see where I put in the nucleus accumbens and VTA, basal ganglia, hypothalamus, hippocampus, just basic areas that it would be affecting, but at this point it's suggesting baseline. So, and then for our INTOC, kind of go through this in more detail. I'll put up the slide as well. When THC enters the system, it floods the CB1 receptors throughout the brain through almost simultaneously. The dopamine surges through the mesolimbic pathway, that's the VTA, to the nucleus accumbens route, and that's where the euphoria comes from. Norepinephrine goes up, increasing arousal and heart rate. Glutamate and serotonin also increase, that kind of contribute to the altered perception and mood. GABA goes down. This is really important. Normally, GABA acts as a brake on dopamine. So THC suppresses that brake, which is why dopamine spikes so high. Acetylcholine drops. And this is why attention and memory encoding take a hit. So 3 main pathways are disrupted in this. The mesolimbic pathway drives reward and euphoria. The mesocortical pathway, VTA to the prefrontal, is responsible for cognitive impairment. So yeah, I don't know if you can see it. But here's where the prefrontal has GABA and glutamate decreasing, hippocampus. Do you want to add anything, Simon?
Yeah, and then this is just like when you're looking at the brain from like this side, this is how it's going to kind of look. And then on the outside in that prefrontal cortex, that's kind of where the GABA is going to see, just so you have like a visual of what that's looking like there. It's kind of hard to see. It's in green, and then we have the arrows in there as well. And then, yeah, what Annie was saying on the inside there of like all around, and the GABA's going down, and the glutamate and things. But yes.
Oh, it's so cool. I love that. Okay. So we kind of already talked about the what's happening in the brain during the intox, and this is kind of going over already what we kind of said. The neurochemistry translate into some recognizable effects. Short-term memory is impaired because of the hippocampal. The prefrontal cortex communication is disrupted. You can't consolidate what you just experienced. The attention and impulse control are affected by the prefrontal cortex suppression as well. Your mood depends heavily on dose. Low doses produce relaxation and euphoria, but high doses can activate the amygdala more intensely and can produce anxiety and paranoia. The famous munchies comes directly from the CB1 activation, and in the hypothalamus, it literally signals hunger even when you've recently eaten, which is kind of interesting. So the neuroimaging research from one of our listed resources that'll be at the end of this, and the colleagues in 2010 confirmed that this directly, THC increases striatal activation and reduces the prefrontal cortex activity. CBD does the exact opposite, attenuating these changes. That's really important finding for understanding the medical potential for CBD, and not yet as much for cannabis. And we'll take it on to Simon.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to go into a little bit about what happens when someone who is going to be regularly using is going to stop, which is our withdrawals. Okay, and then for the next part, So chronic THC exposure is going to force the brain to adapt, as we know with most other substances. So the most significant change that we're going to see is that the change in the CB1 receptors are going to start down regulating, or the brain is going to literally start reducing the density of its own receptors in order to accommodate the ones coming from THC and cannabis use. And it's going to literally make them less responsive, thereby because it's been overstimulated for so long to sort of make up for that overabundance of the use. And at the same time, it's going to reduce production of its own endocannabinoids, anandamide, whatever it is, at 2-AG, because it's become reliant on the external supply from that THC. So when that THC is removed, all of that compensatory adaptations are suddenly going to be without a counterweight. And what you're going to get is that rebound. So dopamine is going to drop below the baseline, causing that dysphoria and that anhedonia that we've been talking about. And then CRF, or corticotropin releasing factor, is going to spike, which is going to drive that stress response. And norepinephrine is going to rebound into hyperarousal, causing the common symptoms of insomnia, that inability to sleep. The hypothalamus is also going to lose its cannabis-driven appetite cue, as we talked about. So the appetite that you would have normally gotten being on cannabis is going to drop. And the mesolimbic circuit, which has been sensitized by chronic use, is going to generate those cravings. So as we saw in the hat I was kind of showing, just kind of all around in that circuit there. I'm not sure how well you guys on the video can see it, but there's that. That's the nucleus accumbens in there and the VTA right in the middle, affecting all of that and going all the way through the brain in this area up here. So research by Kalitsi and colleagues in 2016 is also going to show that chronic cannabis use reduces glutamate specifically in the prefrontal cortex, which is going to contribute to the executive function deficits that can persist into abstinence. So in the withdrawal state, this one, our model is going to show faded green on those CB1 regions. Again, it might be a little bit hard to see. I'll try and do my best to show you guys. But it's going to indicate downregulation in those faded green areas, such as in the cerebellum and the prefrontal cortex here. And we're going to use orange and red to emphasize on the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens to show that anxiety and the cravings that you're going to be experiencing. So right in the center of your brain here, roughly. And then the stress markers are going to appear at the CRF origin sites, which you might be able to see it a little bit on here. And then you're going to definitely feel it in the front areas of your brain in this portion. Again, I don't know if you can see the little stars. That's going to be those stress areas where you'll be feeling that there. Now going into a little bit on tolerance. Tolerance is going to develop as those CB1 receptors downregulate, and the user is going to need more THC to achieve the same effect, again, like we're seeing with so many other substances. This is tissue level dependence, and the body is going to physically be restructuring itself around the presence of the drug. The cannabis use disorder is presently a recognized diagnosis in the DSM-5-TR. It's going to include criteria for tolerance withdrawal and includes things like impaired control, significant social and occupational impacts, among many other symptoms that we've discussed in the past. And the neurobiology that we just described is going to be definitely what we're validating for that clinical diagnosis. And the good news on recovery, with that same source, Kalitsi et al., found that the CB1 receptor density is going to begin recovering towards the baseline after about 4 weeks, which is going to align when cognitive function is also going to start to improve. Most working memory and attention deficits are going to partially recover by about 28 days, but for heavy users, that's going to show in possibly some more persistent deficits beyond that 28-day window. The concerning exception that we have with the substance at present is for adolescent users. So in the source for Volko et al., found that adolescent cannabis exposure is often associated with some long-term reductions in hippocampal volume and some white matter abnormalities that may not fully recover. But a lot more study is obviously going to be warranted for that at present. Going on to developmental and long-term impacts, this is going to bring us to one of our most important findings in the neuroscience that we have at present, is that the developing brain is uniquely vulnerable. So the endocannabinoid system is going to play a really big role in that synaptic plasticity, or the long-term potentiation and depression processes that are going to allow the brain to adapt. So when you introduce those external cannabinoids during that window of development, you're going to disrupt the very machinery that the brain is using to wire itself. So again, like most other substances that we've been seeing, it's going to directly impact the development in the brain and how those synapses are firing, how they're processing, and how they're developing, and whether or not they're going to develop normally into the future. So the result compared to adult users is going to be more severe gray and white matter changes, greater cognitive deficits, and a lower IQ scores in adolescent onset users compared to adults. And the discovery of CB2 receptors in the brain has also opened up a new line of research into neuroinflammation, as an additional mechanism of harm of chronic cannabis use, not just the acute receptor effects that we've been discussing. So what are the clinical takeaways from all of our neuroscience at present? So first, we're going to be talking about things like medical cannabis. The endocannabinoid system is a legitimate therapeutic target, as we're seeing more and more. Cannabis and cannabinoids are often going to be used for pain management, chemotherapy, induced nausea, MS spasticity, and HIV/AIDS-related appetite loss. So CBD has the FDA approval also for refractory epilepsy under the name Epidiolex. I'm unfamiliar how to pronounce that, but it's EPIDIOLEX, Epidiolex, I believe. So correct me if I'm wrong, but that's approved. And second is that cannabis use disorder is a real and neurobiologically grounded condition. The CB1 downregulation, the hypodopaminergic withdrawal, and sensitized craving circuits that we've been describing are going to be measurable. Evidence-based treatments for these are going to include things like cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, as well as some contingency management on there. Third, adolescent brain protection must be a clinical and policy priority. Screening for cannabis use in adolescent patients and providing accurate psychoeducation about developmental risk is going to be a really big part of our responsible clinical practice, not just with cannabis, but for any substance, as we're seeing. And fourth is that understanding the difference between THC and CBD is going to be major. These two compounds are going to have opposing effects on the brain, so knowing just how they compare and contrast with one another. CBD's modulation of CB1 activity is showing real serious promise for anxiety and psychosis risk reduction, potentially without the addiction liability of THC. And to summarize, so cannabis is going to act through the CB1 receptor agonism and thereby disrupting the brain's endocannabinoid retrograde signaling system. The three brain states that we demonstrated for sober, intoxication, and withdrawal show a clear progression from homeostasis to disruption to eventual neuroadaptation. And then...
Sorry. I got a bunch of papers in front of me.
Mm-hmm. And then understanding the neurobiology of cannabis isn't just academic. It's going to directly inform how we approach prevention, treatment, policy, and clinical practice. And it also validates the lived experience of people that are struggling with cannabis use disorder. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching, guys.